Can you help me with a haiku? Does it make more sense in Japanese? Do you have
Partly,
any
yeah.
idea?
Well, partly Japanese
Because
is
haikus
a
are all terrible, right? In English. I mean, some of them have
yeah
punchlines, which
joke. They're
are
jokes. They're just
smart,
line. Yeah, they're
right?
line
Some of
break
them are
jokes.
some of
Yeah,
them are funny. Not and none of them are funny. Some of them demonstrate wit,
yeah,
but it's not enough words. Like I do you have any idea? Have you studied
yeah.
this? Like in Japanese, does it somehow make more sense?
So part of the difference in Japanese is that it's not a so English is uh, a heavily accented language or not it's a stressed language. Like there's
Right.
stress matters a lot.
Right.
French and Japanese syllable matters way more than stress. So
Okay.
so you're when you're counting syllables in English, uh, three of those syllables are going to dominate all the others, and so
I see. So it's
you're
not satisfying. It doesn't
it's not
feel.
satisfying at all.
I see.
Right. So I think probably it's partly that. Probably it's partly that there's a visual component because the language at least has some. The written language at least has some genealogical connection to the ideograms of Chinese, and so it
And the calligraphy itself, has a
right. There's an
beauty. Is
art.
that
Right. Exactly.
right?
There's a whole tradition to the calligraphy itself.
Okay,
Um,
that makes more
yeah. I
sense as
mean, and I'm
well.
guessing also, I don't know as much about the composition of Japanese diction, but my guess is that,
Really, you don't know as much about the composition of
well, no,
Japanese
no, no.
diction as you
Well, no,
do
no.
as of English
Well, no,
diction.
but not even of English, but like of English versus other like versus like Romance languages. Like
Oh, okay,
Spanish, for example, is a very small language. Like there just are very few words in Spanish compared to
right.
English. Like English has way more words than all the rest, and part of that means that like every word has this very precise. Like every word is like we have 50 words for boat, and so what we really have is we have 50 different kinds of boat. And in Spanish you have like barco. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening. And thanks in particular to anybody who has recommended this show to a friend or an enemy. I'm grateful in either case, and it makes a big difference. This has been an interesting week. I have a pizza cooking in the oven, so I'm going to try to keep this quick so I don't burn it or the house down. So you may have noticed that last week's episode has disappeared from the RSS feed. I pulled it for really personal reasons. And you will have another chance to hear it soon enough if you missed it. But I'll just say, in case anyone worries that I've gone soft, that the whole experience only deepened my conviction that the poetry world comfortable need to be afflicted a little more. So I'm certainly looking forward to doing more of that. To which point I do have an announcement I'm going to be making next week. But this week, I thought I would do something a little bit different. So part of the whole goal of this dumb podcast from the beginning was to vent my spleen, to get some things off my chest, but also to provide a little bit of catharsis for people. I imagined, like myself, have felt sometimes a little crazy, a little alienated from the poetry world, the literary world, or have felt like a lot of people are lying or blowing smoke or just full of shit one way or another. And so part of my goal was not to pick on people, but to give people an opportunity to feel somewhat vindicated, at least by some jackass recording in his office in the middle of the night while his children are asleep across the hall. So that's been my goal. I'm going to keep trying to do that. But I also have been, I also don't want to. I've tried from the beginning not to lose track of what finally motivates all this, which is that I fucking like the stuff. I like poetry. So I thought just to shake things up, I would do I would do an episode with just some good things. I just have some good news, some good stuff. So start by saying that I learned about two poets that I won't say I discovered because plenty of other people know about them, but I learned for the first time about two poets I'd never heard of in the past week or two. One was Alexandra Oliver, who's apparently a bigger deal in Canada than she is here. But so Marianne Corbett did a really excellent review of her new book in the LA Review of Books. I think her book is called Hail the Invisible Watchman. And the excerpts she has in there, I mean, Marianne does some really good writing, but the excerpts from Alexandra Oliver's poems are really killer. So I bought the book, and I imagine I will be probably digging into that a little more in episodes to come. Second, I learned about Taylor Bias. I want to say somebody that I've met or that I've talked to by way of the podcast told me about her. Austin maybe told me about her, or maybe Shane, I can't remember. Somebody told me about her, and I looked her up, and she's she's like 24, I think. She's really quite good. I think she has a lot of I think she has the potential to get like a whole lot better too. But I read her. She has a chapbook called Bloodworm that's very good. I actually think some of her best poems have come out online since that was published like a year ago. So I have just an absolute killer of hers that I am going to be reading and talking about in an upcoming episode. So that is to come. And then I also owe a slight apology to Eric Smith, long-suffering and brilliant poetry editor and managing editor of the Sewanee Review, whom I've given a lot of grief on the show. But I teased him about not publishing enough poetry in the Sewanee Review, and the most recent issue has a pretty good deal of poetry. It has a lot of poetry in it, and in particular, it has one poem by Matthew Oltzman, who's a poet I have read and admired at times, but also have had mixed feelings about. But I think this is quite a good poem. He has, incidentally, Matthew Oltzman has one poem in the Sewanee Review, which is excellent, which is an honor for anybody to be published in the Sewanee Review. His wife, Vivi Francis, has 5 poems in the same issue. So I like imagining the mood when that copy arrived on the doorstep. But in any case, so Matthew Oltzman's poem is called The Violin. I would say it is a piece of rhetoric. Like it is a poem that is an argument, which is a risky thing for a poem to do. I've written some poems that are pieces of rhetoric that are arguments. I have mixed feelings about them. I have mixed feelings about this, but I do think it transcends the rhetorical frame by the end. But this is an interesting poem, and it is a poem that it seems initially to be one of those, nerdy fact poems, which Matthew Oltzman sometimes writes. He writes like a lot of, whoa, cool fact man poems. And so this seems to be one of those, but then it takes a turn, and I would say it takes another turn and a half. So this is called The Violin. I'm just going to read this real quick and maybe say one or two words about it. The Violin by Matthew Oltzman, published in the Sewanee Review. God bless you, Eric Smith. Upon hearing that Nero played the violin while Rome burned, I ask, when and how could he have ever learned to play that instrument? It is, frankly, an astonishing feat, considering the amount of time he invested in riding chariots, not governing, murdering his mother, yearning to be an actor, the Parthian War, a revolt in the new province of Britain, the annexation of the Bosporan Kingdom, midnight parties, building hotels, and so on. It's also impressive because the violin didn't exist and wouldn't be invented for another 1,500 years. That alone would prevent lesser men from learning to coax a song from an instrument's fingerboard and bridge, but not Nero. He pressed his non-existent violin beneath his chin and made it wail above the ashes. Some men are just ahead of their times. That's why, whenever any modern Caesar says, "Don't worry," about the plague roiling the streets, I don't. If he boasts about the health of the empire, I raise a glass to celebrate. If he suggests an imaginary horde of barbarians has gathered against us, I sharpen my gladius and rush to the border in the name of freedom. I've learned to recognize our most visionary concertmasters. I've trained myself to embrace the ache of the bow as it moans across the strings, and to finally appreciate how every noise inside me is music. So, this is, I think, I'll go out on a limb and say I think this is a political poem. I initially thought he was doing a neat facts man kind of riff on how Nero couldn't possibly have played the violin. He is doing a little bit of that, but really he is embodying this voice, which is the voice of someone who sees through some popular lies, but decides sort of to accept them anyway. And this note, this was published not long, but notably before the fascinating recent Vanity Fair article about the new reactionary group that longs for an American Caesar, literally, apparently. Not literally. In those terms. But when he says that's why whenever any modern Caesar says, "Don't worry about the plague roiling the streets," I don't. This is, I think this is clearly a jab at Trump, and it does seem to be kind of a riff on people who would blindly and enthusiastically follow Trump. The gladius that he sharpens and rushes to the border with is, of course, a famous Roman short sword. But it's in the end of the poem that I think this becomes, if the poem ended, if he suggests an imaginary horde of barbarians has gathered against us, I sharpen my gladius and rush to the border in the name of freedom. If the poem ended there, it would be kind of a dumb poem, I think. It would be clever enough. It would be a tweetable poem. Oltzmann does indulge in rhetoric at times in other poems, but I think the fact that there are 5 more lines makes sort of all the difference in the world here. I've learned to recognize our most visionary concertmasters. I've trained myself to embrace the ache of the bow as it moans across the strings, and to finally appreciate how every noise inside me is music. Now, he's talking about an imaginary violin. He's talking about people who openly lie and who demand that you believe the lie. But this treatment of music doesn't feel totally satirical. It doesn't feel totally ironic. I've trained myself to embrace the ache of the bow as it moans across the strings. That's not irony. That's not a sarcastic embrace. That's pathos. And to finally appreciate how every noise inside me is music. Now, it's obviously insane to believe that every noise inside you is music, but that kind of what Daniel Dennett might call a deepity, that kind of conviction, that kind of self-affirmation is one that the right has no monopoly on. That could well be a line from a satire of a progressive point of view. And so it leaves me a little bit uncertain of where we all stand. I start the poem feeling quite clear about whom we're satirizing and what good smart side we're on. But by the end, I don't know that Matthew Oltzmann is any longer leaving himself off the hook. I think we all may be on the hook by the end, which is what I really want from any good poem. And I think this is one. So this is The Violin by Matthew Oltzmann in the Sewanee Review. Oh, one more piece of housekeeping I've got to take care of. Shane McRae, truly like hours after I posted last week's episode, in which, among other things, I say that the NEA is not very concerned with the art of its applicants and fellows. It's more concerned with the red tape that constitutes their elaborate applications and all of the artist statements and theses and proposals and community connections and letters of recommendation, whatever other bullshit that is involved in the application other than portfolio. Having said that about the NEA, I then was sort of not that surprised to hear from Shane, who is always both like super prompt and exacting in his responses to the show, but also like endlessly patient and generous. So thank you again, Shane, for writing this note. He just said, having won an NEA, which he has. I mean, that's the problem with like bad mouthing any prize or any honor in poetry today, is that Shane's won it. Like whatever it is, Shane has won it. And I'll say, I think he's, in some ways, he is the exception that proves the rule. If there is a prize in poetry that might come up on this show, like two things are probably, you can probably count on. One is that Shane has won that prize. And two is that he's one of the few people who really genuinely deserved it. But all right, I digress. Having won an NEA, said Shane, I can tell you they use the work submitted when they are trying to talk to people and organizations about the value of the work the NEA does. As in, look at this art which you will, presumably, like or at least think is worthwhile. Support us because we help such things come into being. And I've had people at the NEA write to me with unnecessary, even irrelevant enthusiasm about my poems. So the portfolio seems to matter to somebody. Fair enough. I do think that maybe the NEA could still stand to take some advice, not from me, it is the perennial idiot, but from Alice, who in a recent episode of Poetry Says, made the very simple request of a similar organization in Australia. She said, whatever else you do, however else you think about your prizes and the money you get and how much money goes where, there's one thing you could do that would definitely help artists out, that would definitely make the whole process better. And that is simplifying things. Just make it a little bit easier to apply. So I will pass that advice on to the NEA. As usual, like the best part of this show is stuff that other people say that I then quote. So thank you, Shane. Thank you, Alice. And then for the main segment this week, I really am always really nervous about doing gushy episodes where I just go on at length about some writing I like. But Brian and I talked recently about two really wonderful pieces of writing. One is the short story A Little Cloud by James Joyce, which is a short story about a failed poet. And the other is the poem Minute 40, which is also about failure and maybe failed poets in its way. Both really wonderful. And we ended up having like a pretty fun conversation about both of them. So I'm just gonna get to that. Real quickly, we do mention a couple times IFP. I don't think we end up defining it in the course of the episode, but IFP was Introduction to Fiction and Poetry, and it was a course for freshmen that Brian and I both taught when we were in grad school.
Her point was like how arbitrary an introduction to fiction and poetry could get, like insofar as literally anything could be an introduction to fiction and poetry, it might as well be these texts, like a lot by Eudora Welty and like very little by anybody else, and like you remember that short memoir piece by I think Seamus Heaney about Omphalos, or I just remember it being like, and this is a class that many people took as a distribution requirement. So they were just going to be doctors when they grew up. Like that's why they went to Johns Hopkins. That was the entire plan. That was the entire idea. And they're like, let us just have a taste of what fiction is. And what that taste is just like plotless Southern meandering and like the most Irish text that you need to like look up every 6 words. Digging is a metaphor for life in some way that like only works if you've been raised like literally digging the Irish soil, you know,
Right.
otherwise like any other soil wouldn't give that same impression. But yeah, no, we asked a lot of those students.
Yeah, what a terrible
Strange.
way to approach,
Strange.
right? Just punishing, just like you fool for thinking that maybe that was part of it. It was like, never again will this be considered an easy A course.
Right. But then we all gave A's to everybody, right?
Of course, it
Because
still
why
was
wouldn't
an
we?
easy A course.
Why
It was
wouldn't
just,
we? But you remember we had to grade the assignments. So these poor like freshman pre-med types, we forced them to write sonnets, right, with meter and we're like, I B plus, like this doesn't scan and it's emotionally irrelevant. Like I just don't. I remember it was so sad. They didn't.
my strategy for that, my brilliant insight to the grading, the misery of grading like freshman poems and stories was to grade them all out of 15 points. So it would be harder to do the math in their heads when I initially passed out the paper.
You would physically run out of the classroom
Exactly.
before they could
figure out
doesn't
that
go
like,
evenly into
13 out
100,
of 15
right?
wasn't what they were aiming for.
Shall we do some Joyce and some Justice?
Yeah, let's start with the Joyce and see where the Justice gets us. I realized like there was I went on a long walk with Echo this morning and I memorized the Justice poem so I could like think about it while I was walking, and it occurred to me toward the end of my walk after I'd had all these wonderful thoughts that like there was a risk of this podcast becoming like 90% of poetry podcasts are just like somebody reads a poem and then hums and says, "Oh, that was really nice." And then like the rest of the poetry podcasts are either like people interviewing poets and saying, "Great, now I hope you will blurb my book," or just talking about poems like the way 14-year-old boys talk about supermodels. And so I realized like I don't want to do that, but it is. I think it is a good poem. We can talk.
I
about
have questions and stuff to say about it.
Yeah. Let's. Well, yeah. Well, you tell me. How would you? What you're? Yeah.
Let's start with I think let's start with the Joyce.
Yeah.
And then we'll go to the Justice.
Yeah, A Little Cloud, which we did not teach in IFP, which I falsely.
Well, you might have taught in IFP.
Oh, right. Yeah, I have taught. But in any case, when I taught it in IFP and when I taught it in high school and when I taught it the other week to my adult students, the response from all around was meh.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can't imagine students liking this very much. I wanted to hear your thoughts on why you keep on teaching it to students and why it would be interesting to anybody who isn't a failed poet or writer.
Right.
So what do you think? What do you think what is its intrinsic value? Do you want to summarize it first? Should you say more or less what the story's about? Because it's a relatively quick summary.
Sure. Yeah. So little Chandler, as this guy who's been living in Dublin, his friend Gallagher left 8 years earlier to go make his way in the world. He became kind of a sort of a star in the London press as a journalist. Little Chandler is working an office job, doing some kind of writing that is not that kind of writing. Gallagher comes back to town, invites Little Chandler out for a drink. He goes to meet him. They talk about Gallagher's exciting life, and it reflects somewhat on Chandler's small life with a wife and kid and a boring office job. And then they have a kind of an abortive invitation. Maybe next time we'll go have dinner, but not this time. Little Chandler goes home. He forgot some errands. He got a little too drunk, and his wife left him with the kid. And he tries to think about a poem, and then the baby cries, and he feels sorrow and despair when the baby's crying, and his wife comes home and hates him.
Yeah, right. And he sort of hates his wife a little bit.
Oh yeah. Lots of resentment toward the wife for not being one of Gallagher's imagined
rich Jewesses.
Jesus. Yeah. Yeah.
So what about this do you keep on returning to? Because you've taught it a whole bunch of times. You brought it as the story from Dubliners. It's not typically the story that people remember and want to discuss on podcasts from Dubliners. So what do you think about it? Rings your bell?
I think it's just one of those stories where like every paragraph and sentence I read, it rings so true. It's so consistently funny, start to finish. It's so humiliating in its treatment of Chandler, but in a way that feels weirdly completely fair.
Totally. So that hits me for the first time in this in this paragraph. He remembered the books of poetry upon his shelves at home. He had bought them in his bachelor days. Again, we're not talking about like like big game hunting trophies, right? We're talking about books of poetry. But he had bought them in his bachelor days, and many an evening, as he sat in his little room off the hall, he had been tempted to take one down from the bookshelf and read something out to his wife, but shyness had always held him back. So it's the idea that like his biggest what is it? His biggest, fantasy is taking one of his books of poems down and reading one of the poems to his wife. Right. But he's too shy. He couldn't do that.
Which when I used to teach this as a bachelor, I would think I would say to my students how pitiful this is, and how like he can't even with his wife, the person he's most intimate with in the world, he can't even take a book of
Except now, could you imagine?
Now, imagine Alex has just come home from work. She's like taking a man on the couch with her laptop, and he's like, wait, Alice, hold on.
Wait, Alex, what you're doing. I don't wait. No, kids, go to your room, kids. I have something to talk to your mother about. Honey, I've got my Norton anthology here.
Put down your laptop.
I'm going to read. No, I know you're hungry. No, the glass of wine can wait. I am going to read. Yeah. No, I would be too timid to do that. I would be too timid.
By Robinson Jeffers.
You're right. I mean, that's why the story does work, because it's both like this guy, Little Chandler, is the most pathetic man in the world, and he is all of us, and I think that is a wonderful encapsulation why it's a great story, and your students haven't yet reached the point in their life to
except the adult ones have the 65-year-old was like, no, I didn't really see much in this. I don't.
But does it also have something to do with the fact that
with being a writer?
Yeah, like the could he write something original? So he never, when he talks about writing, he never talks, he never gives examples. He never has any actual ideas. He just has feelings or attitudes.
Well, he does do some writing, but the only writing he does is of potential blurbs for his non-existent book.
For his own book of his own collection of poems that he's unable to write. Yeah. Could he write something original? He was not sure what idea he wished to express, but the thought that a poetic moment had touched him took life within him like an infant hope. He stepped onward bravely.
He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul.
I know.
My heart.
And that's after he was not so old. 32.
Which I also think the other line I love from The Dead is I can't remember Gabriel's last name, but Gabriel O'Clarahan was a young man of 45. Is the line in the Dead. Yeah, no, it is.
He was not so old, 32. His temperament might be said to be just at the point of maturity. There were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in verse. Mm-hmm. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh, as you just read, his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. And that, to me, is something that I remember feeling when I was 16. Yeah. There's so much I'm bursting with emotions. I don't really know what they are. But I would love to be the sort of person to articulate those emotions. Am I the sort of person who can do that? But
then he spends most of his time thinking about his blurbs and thinking about perhaps it would be better to insert his mother's name before. It was a pity his name was not more Irish looking, and he imagines he wouldn't say Thomas Malone. He would be T. Malone Chandler. Would be the way to present his name, which I fucking did. I put my fucking middle name in my book to sound less of a pseudonym.
And his plan is he would speak to Gallagher about it. He had an idea. Let's see if this is the kind of thing that'll work.
And that's part of where you see his genuine feeling of excitement and pride.
Yes,
he's going to go see Gallagher, and Gallagher's a real deal.
So how do you read Gallagher in this story? Because the Little Chandler has different attitudes toward him depending on how excited or drunk or sad Little Chandler is. But how does Joyce want us to see Gallagher? Is Gallagher I think we are meant to read him as a pompous jackass whom Little Chandler is mistakenly looking up to. Is that too simple?
I think it's too complex. I think he is. I think he's a sad prick, but I also think and I was also just struck in by how smart a choice it is that the very first thing Gallagher does, he's like, clearly like Gallagher spends like most of their conversation big dogging Thomas Chandler, or little Chandler, and telling him about, you've never been anywhere but the Isle of Man. Like, you should go to the whorehouses in Paris, you pussy. But he like, and like how, Chandler's never really done anything. And Chandler tries to kind of like do something similar about like, well, you'll get married one of these days. And Gallagher like has this sort of grotesque monologue about how he's just going to marry for money. And he has this, the seams start to show when he's like, hundreds of Jewesses wouldn't.
Wealthy Jewesses will throw themselves at me. My favorite line about him talking about Paris is, they're lively, if you like. It gets lively when the coquettes begin to let themselves loose. And then he doesn't let it just go. He questions little Chandler. He goes, you know what they are, I suppose, meaning the coquettes, which is just like a French ladies.
Well, cocottes, I think, is prostitutes.
It's prostitutes, right. But they cocottes, right. It's prostitute. But little Chandler clearly has no idea and doesn't want to admit that he has no idea. So he goes, I've heard of them. And then, as he said, you may go with you like, there's no woman like the Parisienne for style, for go. Then it's an immoral city, said little Chandler. I mean, compared to London, neither of them know anything.
Well, right. So I think like Gallagher is definitely a blowhard. He's definitely a prick. He's definitely trying to show up Chandler, which also like the other question I have throughout this whole story is like, why did he invite Chandler out? Like, why did he invite him out? And partly because his it seems like his enduring memory of Chandler is of disapproving of him, because he says like, you're always lecturing me to go to church and be right. Right.
I mean, I assume the reason he sees him is to demonstrate that he's made a success for himself as a way to say, you always thought you were better than me, but now I'm back and I'm
right. So I think no, I mean, I think probably if the story were told from Gallagher's perspective, then like he probably is like the man at the bottom of the totem pole in London and gets shit on as like the Irish piece of shit. And like he needs to come home in order to be with his obnoxious orange tie to be the
he's dressed
dog.
Like a clown.
Yeah, and he has like a ghastly pallor and these bright blue eyes, his thinning hair,
pale, sickly face. I mean, again, is a move I wouldn't have made as a writer here if I were to. I wouldn't have thought of it. But the idea of making Gallagher dressed like a clown with like a sickly, sad mien, it's funnier that way. It makes it just like all more sadder. But you were, I think, earlier going to compliment Joyce on making Gallagher kind when they first meet.
No, not on making him kind, but I think like it's a perceptive move that he gives Gallagher as the first move, and like what clearly Gallagher needs to demonstrate his superiority to Chandler. The very first thing he does is say, "Well, and how have you been pulling along since I saw you last? Dear God, how old we're getting." Do you see any signs of aging in me, eh? A little gray and thin on the top. What? Ignatius Gallagher took off his hat and displayed a large, closely cropped head. His face was heavy, pale, and clean-shaven. His eyes, which were of bluish slate color, relieved his unhealthy pallor and shone out plainly above the vivid orange tie he wore. Between these, so he goes, but then he says, what's the gesture I love? He says, he bent his head and felt with two sympathetic fingers the thin hair at his crown. So the first thing he does is he says, look how old I am, and he shows off his bald spot. And it's it's the kind of humility you can show when you're in a position of power. Right. And so it's the very first thing he does, which I think is really smart and perceptive. And I think, there's a version of the story that is told from Gallagher's perspective, which would be equally delightful and very different. But I think it's actually kind of important that we don't come away at the end of this story feeling like, at the beginning of the story, we thought Gallagher had really got on. But at the end of the story, it turns out they're all just failures in their own way. No, like Gallagher genuinely is a success.
We know that.
Chandler never will be, right? And we don't get relieved of that feeling of imbalance by Chandler's failure and his feeling of being trapped. He thinks of himself as being in a prison with the poor baby. Like clearly some of this is like a little bit irrational, and he's a little drunk, and he's reading a very bad poem by Byron at the end, and he wishes he could concentrate on it. It's a really not a good poem. But I think it would be a lesser story if it were all fair in the end, right? If Gallagher were totally put in his place just as much as Chandler is.
For sure. And I, in mixing up Dubliner's stories, forgot whether this was the story where little Chandler falls apart and cries at the end.
Yes.
Or if this is the story where he beats the shit out of his family. and it's
Oh,
not that
I haven't
story.
read that story.
That's a
Is
different
there a story
story.
where little Chandler beats the shit out of his
No,
family?
it's not Little Chandler. It's
Oh,
another
another
guy
guy.
who is
Okay,
Little
all right.
Chandler in
Okay,
his
okay.
story.
Yeah,
Who's like
yeah.
mistreated throughout the day, you know, by
No.
other characters and Dubliners.
No.
And
He
then
doesn't
comes
even
and-
he doesn't even burst
Get
into
out.
tears. It's sadder than that. Little Chandler felt his cheeks suffused with shame, and he stood back out of the lamplight. He listened while the paroxysm of the child's sobbing grew less and less, and tears of remorse started to his eyes. Even his breakdown
he
at the
can't
end
even
is like
cry right.
pitifully Little Chandler-esque.
He counted 7 sobs, this is of the baby, without a break between them, and caught the child to his bosom in fright. If it died! Exclamation point. And I think the implication is like his wife would be so pissed.
You're in
Like,
such deep shit.
oh man, will I be in trouble if my son died? Like, it's literally the 20 minutes all day that I'm responsible for him, and that's when he's gonna die. Like, that'd be typical Little Chandler.
Right. I love later she storms and she says, "What have you done to him?" She cried, glaring into his face. Little Chandler sustained for one moment the gaze of her eyes, and his heart closed together as he met the hatred in them.
And the fact that Joyce makes him even be Little Chandler at home holding his own baby, like he's not he's Chandler. He's
man.
Chandler. But it is Little Chandler is in his house, not able to do anything. He can't talk to his wife, whom he hates, and he just like I feel like the highlight of the story.
He feels her hatred of him more than he hates her, I think.
Oh, totally. He would love to love her. He's just in a situation where, I mean, his happiest memory is when he spent way too much money on a shirt for her, and she yelled at him for spending all that money on the shirt, but then she kind of liked the shirt. Like,
Right.
I think that's the best moment of his life.
Yeah, but it's described. He says how he had suffered that day, waiting at the shop door until this is just. He has money. He has plenty of money to go buy clothes for his wife. He's waiting until the shop was empty, standing at the counter and trying to appear at ease while the girl piled ladies' blouses before him, paying at the desk and forgetting to take up the odd penny of his change, being called back by the cashier, and finally striving to hide his blushes as he left the shop by examining the parcel to see if it was securely tied.
That last line is so good, where he's trying to distract himself from being so ashamed of successfully buying clothes at a clothes store that he's like extra focused on the knot that the lady made to make sure that the knot.
Does this knot?
looks like it will hold.
Shape to me. No, it's so my question, and it may be that it just doesn't matter because it's so good and funny and on the like it hits the nail on the head, but the story like the corruption I use from the Seder supper for talking about stories is, why is tonight different from every other night? Like, why, if you're going to write a story about a guy in a day, why is it this day in his life? Like, what happens on this? And like, there are stories like The Dead or Araby where like clearly it's a transformative day. Like, it matters that this was the day and something, he's not going to be the same guy afterward. I'm not totally sure with Chandler if this day is going to be different than the next. Like, it's a big day because Gallagher comes back to town, but I can't tell if he's much changed by the end.
I read Dubliners through this story in prep for this conversation. This is probably story number 7 or 8. And just like looking at it, like the first story, the guy's mentor dies. So he's not gonna, that's the sisters, that after that, he's not gonna be the same. Mm-hmm. The second story, the main character goes on a small trip. He skips school for the first time and he meets a guy who jerks off in front of him. And like that is his first, interaction with sexuality. And that's going to be like he's going to change after that experience. The third story is Araby, where he has a crush and he goes and he stays out late and he goes to this fair to buy something for this crush of his. And that moment of not being able to, he's going to remember for the rest of his life. Eveline, even more than the rest of them, is about someone who has been proposed to, who's getting ready to leave her small town in Ireland, goes all the way to the point of packing, of not telling her alcoholic father, whom she's taken care of, that she is going to leave him and abandon him, essentially, goes to the boatyard and at the very last moment does not get on the boat. So all these stories are really like epiphanic moments that change the course of these people's lives, until A Little Cloud. And I think that the answer can't be that this is the exception that proves the rule. I think it has to be, what about this day does change the course of his life? And maybe up until this day, he had hope that he would be a poet of some kind. And this is the day that crushes it for him. That, today, he's still fantasizing about reading poetry to his wife. He's still thinking of himself as more than just the clerk that he is. He has these questions he's going to ask little Gallagher. He has, the blurbs in his mind. He has this poetic spirit. He has all of that. And then he goes for drinks. It's an unsatisfying experience. He comes home. He can't even read poetry alone by himself. He can't father his own kid. He can't be a husband to his wife. And the story ends. And I think that maybe the last ounce of potential has been sucked out of him. And that's why this day matters, unlike the previous 50 days of similar disappointment and failure.
The situation hasn't changed, but his pipe dream is gone by the end.
Right.
He was nothing was going to happen differently, but he vaguely believed something might happen.
He gives up hope. And I think that part of self-definition in Little Chandler is that he might have a poetic, soul or spirit within him. He's small and his wife has unkind eyes and he can't take care of his kid, but maybe there's some poetry in me. And I think that the change from beginning to end of this story is not as obviously dramatic or profound, but it's the moment where he settles into his passive, horrible existence, that he doesn't have that in him, and he comes to terms with that and falls apart.
Yeah. Part of me reading this story, I always thought that this was like the kid in Araby if he had never had the experience of Araby. Because at the end of that story, he feels himself. It's some a cosmic vision of himself. There's a creature. Yeah. See if you can read the last sentence or so of Araby, because it feels like the epiphany that Little Chandler never had as a kid, or never had until he was 32.
So at this point in Araby, he's looking for a present to purchase for this girl with whom he's in love, and he's a teenager. He's young, a young teenager going to this big fair, but he gets there too late because his uncle doesn't remember that he wants to go, but he has his money. I lingered before her stall, meaning one of the stalls that are open, because most of them are closed, though I knew my stay was useless. To make my interest in her wares seemed the more real. Then I turned away slowly and walked down the middle of the bazaar. I allowed the 2 pennies to fall against the 6pence in my pocket. I heard a voice call from one end of the gallery that the light was out. The upper part of the hall was now completely dark. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger.
Yeah, the creature driven and derided by vanity. Yeah, that's, God. And it feels like that never quite struck home for Little Chandler until maybe.
Right, the profundity of that moment in Araby is intense enough to drive the protagonist of that story into some new direction, whether less vanity or more, who knows in the long run, but that character could more be a Stephen Dedalus character, that shows up.
The kid in Araby could become Joyce, right?
Right, exactly.
But Little Chandler is
Joyce, right? Little Chandler is exactly. Exactly. And I think that's the big moment, and I think that's why Araby is read more often, because it fits in the trajectory of the kid in Araby to Stephen Dedalus to Joyce, himself. Right. Whereas this is a standalone sad story about the other direction, which is somebody who hangs on.
So you're identifying a couple of things. You're identifying both why I love it and why my students hate it.
I think that's right.
It's hopeless.
Yes. It's somebody who begins the story with a little bit of hope and then loses that hope.
It has it just pinched out of him. I love that.
Which is a gutsy story to write, especially in this mode, which isn't a comic mode, but it's sort of
it's pretty funny.
So realist that comedy is drawn from it. It's not a farce where except his name is Little Chandler, so he is playing with, he's mocking the guy, but he's mocking him the way his friend would mock him. He's not mocking him from on high.
No, it feels like a plausible form of mockery, right? The same way that despite all of the craziness in the show, Big Pussy felt like a plausible nickname for a gangster in The Sopranos. So
Totally. And also in the same way that Little Chandler is repeated over and over again until it just becomes his name.
You forget
Big Pussy is just it becomes the sounds that make up his name. You don't think Big Pussy is the craziest nickname in the whole world. There's one episode in The Sopranos where it's like, yeah, there was a little pussy and then the big pussy, and that's why it makes sense. But like even that explanation makes no sense. Like why are there two pussies? And like then therefore one big, one little. But it is, if you just repeat a nickname long enough, it just sounds like somebody's name.
So then similarly, the other question I have about the story, which like again intuitively makes plenty of sense, but I can't come up with any explanation for, is the title. Like it's kind of like a little cloud is kind of like a little Chandler, and it's sort of pitiful and cute and like but it doesn't, like it feels right, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what it means.
I know it doesn't mean anything. And also if it were me, like that sort of accidental rhyme or repetition of word should grate, right? Like the idea of naming your main character Little Chandler and then naming the title of your story A Little Cloud. Like little is in both, but it doesn't really line up, and there are no other mentions of clouds, and it's not the Little Cloud. So I have no idea.
But I have no idea. I actually think that A is so much better than the, because
it's like softer and sadder.
It's also like it's not like this is the one time. It's like this is like one of many, one of an innumerable quantity of little clouds. A little
cloud. But also like there's no vernacular, like it's not like we talk about a little cloud. Like it's not.
So why wonder if there
is there an Irish expression?
Old Irish expression? That's actually the most plausible explanation. Suddenly,
we both.
Right, I know we're both Googling, and the problem is
slang.
Oh, did you find it?
No, maybe not.
I was going to say that the problem is that the existence of the story is going to drown out any possibility of us finding any reference to an actual meaning. I don't know. Maybe so. If you are listening and you know this
from Ireland,
yeah. Well, and Peter Vertasnik seemed to recognize the reference right away and know Dubliners pretty well. Maybe he'll know. He seems well informed.
Yeah, ask that guy. Is he one of the like 4 identical guests whom you've had over the last month or so? Was he like a staid white man who had like some stuff to say about poetry that you mostly agreed with? Was he one of those guys? I didn't bother learning their names, but I listened to all 4 of those episodes, and all of those 4 very different men had very, very fascinating perspectives on formalism and structure in poetry. Really, they really stood out one from the next. I'm really happy to have spent all those time trying to differentiate their identical opinions from one another. They strongly disagreed with an article in the LA Review of Books. Let's hear more about that.
Oh man, I just realized that I have an interview.
You have another one?
A middle-aged white man about an article in the LA Review of Books that I haven't put out yet.
I have something that feels like a very strong opinion to myself that any listener to will just think of as like a boring one sentence idea. But next up on Sleerick, it's a middle-aged white man has a very strong opinion on an essay from the LA Review of Books about whether structure is important to verse. I can't wait for that episode.
Yes. God damn it.
So Donald Justice wrote this poem, Men at 40. Is there a direct connection to A Little Cloud here, other than the fact? Actually, I shouldn't say other than the fact, because that's leading the witness.
Right.
I see a connection or two, but I would love to hear whether it's just a poem you like, so you wanted to read it on your show because you're allowed to, or do you feel it is connected to A Little Cloud in ways that it seemed to be to me?
Yeah, I think it has some connection to A Little Cloud. I don't think it's important, and I think like the part of what I really disliked about the initial IFP syllabus that we were given was that it was constantly pairing essays and stories and poems that had somewhat similar themes, and that seems like an incredibly boring way to teach writing. So I would never want to pair this with A Little Cloud as a teacher.
Right. It's puzzle solving as teaching or
God,
something,
yeah.
where it's like, what's the right answer? They both talk about innocence, like you see it, especially
Like,
my eighth
oh
graders,
my God.
when I try never to ask a question for which there is one right answer,
Right.
because
Yeah,
otherwise it feels like math to the students and their eyes get like anxious and they try to, the father wants to know where the son hid the bicycle, I'm like, well, that's not really what we're talking about here.
Why did I ask
But
you this?
yeah, why, like, I did ask what the father wants to know, and that is the answer. But like, why are we spending our time with this?
You should just, one of those days, you should just quit your job upon receiving the answer from your kids.
That's it. I'm done. Yep. Thank you. I'm out. All right. We're Fletch. You're in charge.
Yeah.
And
to clarify, because I would have, with my homophonic ear, heard the title as Minuteforty, as in it was like as if it were a story about
minute 40,
about
as
like
opposed to the
minute
previous
40 of a
minutes.
basketball game.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Men at 40. Men at 40.
Yeah, by Donald Justice.
Read it for us.
Yeah, Men at 40.
You probably don't even need to read it. It's probably existing inside your brain.
It is, but I'll read it to make sure I don't fuck it up. Men at 40.
Wait. Is this the first poem that you and I have ever discussed together?
This was my elaborate trick to get you to talk about a poem on air, which has never happened before.
Oh, I gotta put on my poetry clothes.
Well, I did. So I have a follow-up question about one of our early exchanges about poetry. But I'll read.
Okay, but no. Now I'm ready. Now I gotta. This is gonna be. Here we go.
All right, good.
Got my boots on. Got my digging shoes. I got my shovel ready.
Between my finger and my thumb.
There you go.
Squat mic rests. Yeah. All right, Men at 40. Jesus Christ. Seamus Haney, actually a good poet, which you would never know if you had taken the IFP course that we were getting.
No, it's only his terrible poems that we read. I liked his translation of the Gilgamesh. No, is that what he translated?
He was a pretty prolific translator. Yeah, I actually liked digging, but I didn't like it when I taught it in that class.
Yeah, exactly. Because we surrounded it by so much ephemera and hideous hard work that the poem itself becomes unreadable. Men at 40 by Donald Justice, read by Matthew by M. Buckley Smith.
That's really forward the Irish middle name. Men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms they will not be coming back to. At rest on a stair landing, they feel it moving beneath them now like the deck of a ship, though the swell is gentle. And deep in mirrors, they rediscover the face of the boy as he practices tying his father's tie there in secret. And the face of that father, still warm with the mystery of lather. They are more fathers than sons themselves now. Something is filling them. Something that is like the twilight sound of the crickets, immense, filling the woods at the foot of the slope behind their mortgaged houses. So, well, since you've never talked about a poem on this show, why don't you have a word? And then I have too many words, so I'll try to restrain myself.
So I think this poem is great. I think it's funny and smart. I think that as a 41-year-old man, I think I'm 41, rings true. Men at 40 learn to close softly. I think that initial almost rhyme is sort of jarring in a successful way. It gets you paying attention, and that's something that the line breaks help. The door to rooms they will not be coming back to. That is so obviously a metaphor that I like it. That like I don't need to play with like whether something is standing in for something else. Like it's clear that at 40 there's some stuff you don't do anymore, right? And that's I think a fun way to start a poem about a 40-year-old. The second stanza confuses me.
Yep.
At rest on a stair landing, they feel it moving beneath them now like the deck of a ship, though the swell is gentle. So they feel it moving is weird to me. The they refers, the antecedent there is clear. It's the men at 40. It is odd. The only thing it could refer to is stair landing. But then why are we spending time actually talking about men on a stair landing feeling it rocking back and forth? Is that like they're old now? am curious what you have to say. My only possible answer to that is it makes that final punchline hit home more, because the mortgaged house described as a mortgaged house wouldn't, you don't need a reminder of that house's existence, the physicality of the real house, if you have that second stanza of like a man trying to keep his sea legs, land legs straight, like balancing in the house itself.
Yeah.
And then seeing a guy in the mirror, half a kid and half a grown up, like that's a powerful image. And I think that one that we've all had at our age, especially at our age, where I do see my son's face in my face and my father's face in my face.
This is something I wonder about, because I don't miss having boy children. The one thing I'm very aware of not experiencing as a father who doesn't have boys is that sort of poignant recognition of myself. I do obviously recognize a lot of myself in my daughters, and I've recognized a lot of childhood, but I think there's enough of a significant difference there that I don't see myself in that direct way that I wonder about you with your boys.
Yeah, so I wish I had girls instead of boys.
I'm so glad I don't recognize myself.
Yeah, I find that I was thinking about this the other day as I was screaming at my kids. I think that I am. It's not an original thought, but it's definitely true for me that I am at my most vicious towards my kids when I see what I dislike most in myself in them.
Totally, yeah.
And I think that comes across more because they have more similar experiences than they would if they were girls, whether it's physical or athletic or otherwise. And it's when I see Owen trying to be funny in moments that aren't appropriate.
Oh God, that's got to be.
It's when I know that in myself, and I hate that I do that in myself. And it's when I feel weakest and most pathetic. And I really, like, the other day I found myself saying, like, I don't think you know what a joke is. Like, did you think that this was an appropriate situation for someone to laugh in? Did you think that the thing you just said was going to make me laugh? Because if not, that's not a joke. And I don't know why you said that. And then I walked out of the room and I'm like, what the fuck did I just, like, my kid's 8 and he said a joke. Like, I don't, like, that is just me screaming at myself. And I am trying, like,
so I don't have that. That's not the thing with my kids, but like, I know that feeling. I know that, like, God damn it. Why don't you pay it? Like, she's trying to talk to you. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, with that example, it most directly made me realize, like, whoa, like, this is not good parenting. Like, I have to be way more aware of that. But absolutely. I mean, they are more their fathers than their sons. I mean, they are more fathers than sons themselves now. That is certainly true, both in my relationship with my father. I am not so much a son as I used to be, and in a relationship with my son, I am far more a father. So like, that rings true. And I'm not a poetry guy, but I do think that Donald Justice takes a great advantage of, like, the first stanza being a relatively long single sentence, the second stanza being a relatively long single sentence, the third stanza is a long beginning of a sentence that bleeds into the fourth, and then just that sentence, they are more fathers than sons themselves now, is just on its own line. And I think that it highlights it as sort of the center of the poem in an incredibly effective way, which allows the something is filling them, something that is like the twilight sound of crickets immense. Again, I don't have many frames of reference. I like that Mark Strand poem, The Garden, with that it shines, even though there's no, like, obvious antecedent to the it shining there. Yeah. There's nothing concrete that it's talking about, but that the it shines, or the something immense, it's what Little Chandler is thinking about. Like, does he have in him that, like, that poetic spirit, that something? And it borders on saccharine in this poem, like the something immense, the crickets. So then undercutting it with the fact that the house isn't only a house, but it's a mortgaged house, I think takes a lot of the air out of the poem in an appropriately self-deprecating way. So I think this poem really works. I think that it's funny at the end and moving in the middle and gets you in the beginning. And I'm a fan.
Yeah. So I mean, a couple of thoughts I had, because I think something you said in a previous conversation was that your feeling about poetry is not that you strongly like or dislike it, but rather that it is a pleasure that is slighter than the effort required to receive it, to
Yes,
get it there.
exactly.
It's sort of like a nut with more shell than meat.
Exactly.
And that makes sense to me. And so thinking about this poem and all of the dumb little smart poetry thoughts I had walking around thinking about it this morning, it occurred to me that this poem in particular is one that I liked the very first time I read it. I liked it more the second time I read it, and I've come back to it, and memorized it and thought about lines in it and had lines of it come back to me. It's a poem I enjoyed, and then I've thought about it and pulled it apart and tried to understand it in response to my enjoyment. But I think if you had to do it the other way around, it would be terrible.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's very well said. You sent me a poem about, you've read it, I think, in one of the earlier episodes of Slee Ricketts, but it's the guy whose truck was on fire and he gets all pissed off about it.
Yeah, Steve Scafidi.
I feel like that. I feel like that has a similar experience of reading the poem, and you're like, "Oh, that's good and sort of meaningful and funny." And now let me try to understand it, as opposed to needing to put the work in initially in order to understand it, in order to enjoy it.
Yeah.
So what did I miss in my sort of layman's gloss? Like what do you feel? A real poetry person would understand or would be able to add to the conversation.
Sure. I think there are a handful. I think that your observation about the length of the sentences broken over the course of the stanzas is a really apt one. I think that you're right about it's full of off rhymes, 40 softly landing, moving, mirrors, rediscover. Father and lather is maybe the best slant rhyme in English.
Yeah.
Especially in that context.
Because it should work perfect. I mean, it should be a direct rhyme, but
also it just
differently.
It's just so spot. I mean, there are wonderful things, like there are a handful of moments where he doesn't need a word, like denotatively, but he includes it for the sake of rhythm or sound, like the word there in the 12th line. The face of the boy as he practices tying his father's tie in secret gives you all the same information, but there sort of breaks the leg of that line and slows it down. And it also picks up the there of the father and lather. And then twilight in the pre-antepenultimate line is unnecessary because, of course, that's when crickets make their sound. But it's one of those fake spondies that's really a trochee that Joshua Megan talked about, and it slows down what would otherwise be too many galloping anapests in a row, or dactyls, depending on how you break it.
But then why doesn't the redundancy piss you off? Like because the sound is just worth the trade?
Because it just feels right. And I think it also helps that the poem's very slight and short anyway. That there's so little happening that a little bit
because it's funny. I noticed the redundancy, but I thought it had something to do with making that moment almost falsely or too bigly poetic, as I said earlier, which is then gets undercut by the house being mortgaged. I wonder whether
I think that's a potential. If I were to point to potential soft spots in the poem, that's one of them. I think that the something is filling them, something that is like the twilight sound of the crickets immense filling the woods at the foot of the slope. So the thing that is filling them is like the sound of the crickets filling the woods, and the twilight, if anything, is doing double redundant work, telling us both when crickets make their sounds and reminding us that this thing, if not being time, is something with that in its, writing its tales, that this is time, that the something filling them, unlike the something that Chandler hopes will fill him up, is not a poetic spirit, but is the advance guard of death. And then, but then I think the other soft spot, and it's one that I feel very ambivalent about, is, as you pointed out, that second stanza. I think so you say it's a moment where we feel we have a physical contact. It's nice. It's rather than just being visual or auditory images, it's a kinesthetic image.
Sure, but why don't you cut it? Like why don't you cut that second stanza?
So I think
and again, for the listener, the second stanza is. At rest on a stair landing, they feel it moving beneath them now, like the deck of a ship, though the swell is gentle.
Right. So the three thoughts I've had about that are one.
And let me just, I want to read it without that stanza because it works. Men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms they will not be coming back to, and deep in mirrors they rediscover the face of the boy. Right, like that.
Yeah, I think it works relatively well. I think you miss a step between the doors to rooms that we'll not be coming back to, as you said, is a very obvious metaphor that needs no explanation. But it is, those doors are metaphorical. They're not real doors. But then as soon as we walk out of those doors onto the stair landing, they become sort of real doors.
Yeah.
And the stair landing, as you said, gives us a physical connection, a physical experience of what we will later realize is this mortgaged house that we're in. And so it's this sort of, it's this middle ground between this totally metaphorical door and this totally real house. And the other thing I think it does, so part of what bothered me most about it is that it is the one alien image in the story, or in the poem. Like in Philip Larkin's This Be the Verse, famously, or as Stephen Campo was the first to point out to me, includes in the last stanza, man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. The coastal shelf in that poem is the only image that doesn't belong there, that's sort of pulled from a different landscape, and it exists purely in order to present us with a perfect rhyme for yourself at the end. So this is an alien image of a ship in here that is the only image in here that doesn't really belong to the suburban, milieu. But I think part of what I heard, part of what I've always taken that to be, is literally a moment of slight imbalance, which precedes, because the swell is gentle, right? The swell could be rough. It could be a big wave. It's a little wave. There's a slight, foreshadowing of, the loss of balance, the loss of steadiness that is going to come with age. But the other thing that occurred to me today is that it's one of these moments like in 90 North, where the kid's imagining himself as an Arctic explorer, where it's the sort of thing a little boy would do, where he would, like, maybe for the little boy it was a pirate ship that was sailing the high seas, and now there's just a little echo of that boyish imagination left. I still think, the fact that it is an alien image, it's the ship in there, still feels a little odd to me, but then I do think that he does a really nice job landing the poem, so to speak, with, he's standing on a deck that is tilting, and then at the end of the poem, we reach the woods at the foot of the slope. So we return to that image of the feet standing on the slanted ground, even if it's, in that case, it's metaphorical, whereas before it was literal.
Sure thing. And water comes back with the shaving as well later on. That it's
and the filling, I guess, like filling up the slope and the min. Yeah, I just like the poem a lot, and I find there's I think like the fact that the first two lines of most of the stanzas rhyme and then the others don't rhyme, it gives the stanzas get sort of wider as they go, and then wider one after another, gives you a sense of sort of form and perfection being lost over time. So there are some really nice formal things happening with it, but I also just mostly enjoy it, and then I find that pulling at it only enhances my pleasure in it.
So you said in a previous lyric, it's that something that bothered you in contemporary poetry is like a concrete image or something general, and then a final line that is a non sequitur to something much bigger, like the "I have wasted my life" final line, or other poems like that. Is this the opposite of that in some ways? Is this like taking you down with the word mortgage to something so specific that it shifts on you in a satisfying way? Or because in some ways it's the same trick. It's it's taking it's taking language from a completely different register and putting it in the final line of a poem,
right? Exactly.
As a punch to the gut. So is it a similar trick or an opposite trick, or how do you feel about that? Or is it not a trick? Is that too dismissive? But it feels like a trick to me. It feels like we're in sort of poetry language all the way until the penultimate word of the poem.
Yeah, mortgaged is that's a huge word. I think what you said is basically right. Like the register of it is part of what startles us so much at the end. It's business language, it's mundane, it's exactly the kind of thing that a little boy would never in a million years think of, and that if maybe 40,
like, oh shit, the guy's 40, like it's not a theoretical poetic vessel, it's this fucking thing that I'm in debt because of. Like
right.
It makes it.
And the mortgage, like the dead pledge, to take it literally, is like just don't forget, like if you fuck up and like if you drop dead right now, don't worry, the bank will get their money.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's the register does an enormous amount of work there, and I think you're right that it is sometimes like in workshops the expression people use is the ending is earned. I think that's sort of an annoying expression, but he uses the pieces that he has brought into the poem in order to resolve it in, I think, a way that feels pretty satisfying. It doesn't If it ended on the deck of the ship, I would feel a lot more unhappy about that intrusion. Right. Yeah, I just think it's one of those poems that one of the reasons I come back to it, and then one of the reasons this is a poem I deeply and genuinely envy, is that so much of it feels inevitable, obvious. I mean, like as with that opening, the doors to rooms they will not be coming back to, that it feels like of course this has always been a poem somebody wrote.
Right.
And it was just, I mean, Donald Justice at his best really wrote like that. That was my conversation with Brian. I will have links to everything that came up in this week's episode in the show notes, as always. And again, an announcement coming next week. I was going to make it this week, but some things came up. So announcement to come next week that will either thrill or irritate any of you who have bothered to listen this far into the episode. In any case, thank you so much, as always, for listening. You can reach me at Slee Ricketts on Twitter and at sleericketts@gmail.com by email, and Brian as well as at bplatzer on Twitter, and Alice is at poetry_says on Twitter, and she sometimes, as Ethan McGuire said, thank you, Ethan, truly the number one super fan of Slee Ricketts, truly, like, I mean, just outstrips all the competition. But Ethan said that Alice should be made a co-host of Slee Ricketts, or at least an unofficial one. And so I hereby name Alice Allen a co-host of Slee Ricketts, official, unofficial, or otherwise. Thank you all again. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.